Dakota's bank account held exactly $14.32. She was 23, sleeping in a freezing Honda Civic, and utterly desperate. So, when the county auctioned off an abandoned, rotting post office for $1, she bought it. She had no idea the rusted steel vault hidden in the basement was about to make her the target of a ruthless millionaire and uncover a 70-year-old federal conspiracy. The wind howling through Grafton, New Hampshire on that bitter Tuesday in November felt like a personal insult. 23-year-old Dakota Hastings sat in the back row of the Grafton County Municipal Gymnasium, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm paper cup of diner coffee, trying to absorb the heat before her fingers went completely numb. She wasn't there to buy property. She was there because the gymnasium was heated, and her 1998 Honda Civic, parked outside with a failing alternator and a trunk full of her only worldly possessions, was not. Dakota had hit rock bottom 3 weeks earlier. A sudden medical emergency involving her younger sister had drained her meager savings, and a subsequent layoff from her data entry job had severed her only lifeline. Evicted and exhausted, she was surviving on dollar menu items and sheer, stubborn willpower. At the front of the gym, county auctioneer David H. Brewster, a balding man with a microphone that constantly gave feedback, droned through the list of tax-delinquent properties. Lot 42, Brewster announced, adjusting his glasses. The old municipal post office at 402 Elm Street, abandoned since 1989, structurally compromised. The county is absorbing the back taxes. We just want it off the ledger. Let's start the bidding at $5,000. Silence echoed in the gymnasium. A few local contractors chuckled. Everyone in Grafton knew the old Elm Street post office. It was a gargantuan, crumbling monolith of gray stone, its windows boarded up, its roof partially caved in. It was an asbestos-filled liability, a black hole for anyone's wallet. 2,000, Brewster pleaded. 1,000. Come on, folks, the land alone is worth something. More silence. Brewster sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the drafty room. $50. I'll take $50. When no one moved, Brewster gripped the podium. $1. I am asking for a single $1 bill to transfer the deed of 402 Elm Street. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Maybe it was the crushing weight of her reality, the desperate clawing need to own something, to have a door she could lock that wasn't attached to a dying Honda. Without thinking, Dakota raised her hand. Brewster's eyes snapped to the back of the room. Sold. To the young woman in the back for $1. A collective gasp, followed by murmurs of pity and amusement, rippled through the room. Dakota lowered her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled $1 bill, and walked down the aisle. She had just bought a 6,000-square-foot disaster zone. 2 hours later, armed with a heavy brass key and a terrifying legal deed, Dakota stood before 402 Elm Street. The building was an imposing relic of 1920s federal architecture, flanked by decaying stone pillars. The front doors were heavy oak, scarred by decades of harsh New England winters and local vandals. She pushed the key into the rusted lock. It required a hard, violent twist, but the mechanism finally gave way with a heavy clack. Inside, the smell hid her first, a suffocating mixture of mildew, dry rot, and old paper. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light piercing through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The main lobby was a graveyard of mail carts and shattered glass. Old, faded, wanted posters from the 1980s still clung stubbornly to the corkboards. What have I done? Dakota thought, the sheer scale of her mistake crashing down on her. The roof in the sorting room had failed, leaving a massive pile of soggy debris on the hardwood floor. It would take tens of thousands of dollars just to make it habitable, money she didn't have. But as she walked through the supervisor's office at the back of the building, a foot caught on something. A heavy iron ring flush with the floorboards hidden beneath a rotting rug. A trapdoor, grabbing a discarded piece of metal piping, Dakota pried the trapdoor open. A narrow concrete staircase spiraled down into pitch blackness. She pulled out her cracked smartphone, turned on the flashlight, and descended into the freezing air of the basement. The basement was surprisingly dry, unlike the floors above. It was a sprawling, low-ceiling space filled with rusted filing cabinets. But it wasn't the cabinets that caught Dakota's attention. At the far end of the room, behind a partially collapsed wall of cheap drywall that looked like it had been hastily erected in the 1980s, sat a monster. It was a Maslow safe, a massive floor-to-ceiling bank vault entirely out of place in a municipal post office. The steel door was at least 10 inches thick, painted a dull, chipping olive green, and secured by a heavy brass combination dial and a massive spoked wheel. The Maslow Safe Company logo, faded but unmistakable, was emblazoned across the top. Dakota walked up to it, her breath pluming in the cold air. She pressed her hand against the freezing steel. It didn't hum, it didn't rattle, it was perfectly, immovably solid. Why would a small-town post office need a vault designed to withstand a military explosive? And more importantly, why had someone gone through the trouble of building a fake wall to hide it before the building was abandoned? She tried the heavy, spoked wheel. It didn't budge a millimeter. The vault was locked tight. And inside, lying dormant for over 30 years, was a secret that was about to flip her world upside down. By the next morning, the town of Grafton was buzzing with the news. The local diner, a greasy spoon named the Copper Kettle, was alight with gossip about the crazy broke girl who bought the town's biggest eyesore. Dakota was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a glass of tap water and utilizing the diner's free Wi-Fi to research Maslow safes, when a shadow fell over her table. She looked up to see a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored camel hair coat that cost more than Dakota had earned in her entire life. He had sharp, predatory eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Dakota Hastings, I presume?" he said, sliding into the booth opposite her without an invitation. "I'm Richard Sullivan, Sullivan Development." Dakota knew the name. Sullivan owned half the commercial real estate in the county. He was the kind of man who bought up struggling family farms and turned them into strip malls. "Can I help you, Mr. Sullivan?" Dakota asked, keeping her tone neutral. "I heard about your little acquisition yesterday at the auction," Sullivan said, steepling his fingers. $1. Quite the bargain. But let's be realistic, Miss Hastings. That building is a death trap. The asbestos removal alone will bankrupt you, not to mention the structural fines the city will start levying against you by next week. I'm aware of the challenges," Dakota lied smoothly. "I'm a man who appreciates ambition, but I also recognize a sinking ship," Sullivan continued, reaching into his coat and pulling out a sleek leather checkbook. "I need the land for a new logistics center. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 right now. You walk away with a massive profit, and you never have to step foot in that rotting husk again." What? Dakota stared at the pen hovering over the checkbook. $5,000. It would fix her car. It would get her a warm apartment. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But her mind flashed back to the basement, to the hastily erected drywall, to the massive hidden Maslow vault. Why was a multi-millionaire developer personally tracking down a 23-year-old at a diner the morning after an auction for a building everyone claimed was worthless? $10,000, Sullivan said suddenly, misinterpreting her silence. He clicked his pen. $10,000, Dakota. Right now. The desperation in his voice was microscopic, but Dakota heard it. He didn't want the land, he wanted what was inside the building. He knew about the vault. "The building isn't for sale, Mr. Sullivan," Dakota said, sliding out of the booth. Sullivan's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "You are playing a game you don't understand, little girl. That building will ruin you. Sell it to me now, or I promise you'll be begging me to take it off your hands by Friday." "Have a good day, Richard," Dakota said, walking out of the diner. Her heart was racing. She needed to get that vault open, and she needed to do it immediately. Through a deep dive on obscure locksmithing forums, Dakota found her man, Henry Hank Caldwell. Hank was a 71-year-old retired bank security consultant who lived in a cluttered Airstream trailer on the edge of town. He was notoriously grumpy, legally blind in his left eye, and arguably one of the best safecrackers on the East Coast. It took Dakota 3 hours and her last $14 spent on a 6-pack of imported stout to convince Hank to even look at the vault. When Hank finally stood in the freezing basement of the post office, illuminating the Mosler with a heavy-duty work light, he let out a low whistle. "This ain't no petty cash drop box, kid," Hank rasped, running his calloused fingers over the brass dial. "This is a Mosler Class 5, solid manganese steel, drill-resistant hard plate. 2 layers of copper to disperse heat from cutting torches. They use these in Federal Reserve branches. Can you open it?" Dakota asked, shivering in her thin jacket. "Depends," Hank said, pulling a massive toolbox from his truck. "Do you have 3 days and a high tolerance for frustration?" Over the next 72 hours, the basement became a torture chamber of screeching metal and flying sparks. Hank used a magnetic drill press, attaching it directly to the face of the vault. He went through a dozen diamond-tipped carbide drill bits, cursing violently every time one snapped against the Mosler's internal glass relockers booby traps, designed to permanently jam the safe if tampered with. The tension outside the building was just as thick. Dakota noticed a black Lincoln Navigator idling across the street on the second day. She recognized the driver, one of Richard Sullivan's foremen. They were watching her, waiting. By the evening of the 3rd day, Dakota was exhausted, covered in metallic dust, and running on nothing but adrenaline. Hank was hunched over the dial, peering through a fiber-optic borescope he had threaded into a microscopic hole he'd managed to drill through the casing. "All right," Hank muttered, his voice hoarse. "I'm on the wheel pack. I can see the gates." He began turning the massive brass dial. Click, click. Click. The sound was deafening in the quiet basement. "First number," Hank said. He spun it the other way. Click, click. Second number. Dakota held her breath. The air felt suffocatingly heavy. Hank spun the dial one last time and stopped. He grabbed the heavy-spoked wheel and strained against it. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a waking giant, a deep metallic groan echoed through the basement. The locking bolts, each as thick as a man's forearm, retracted with a heavy thud. "We're in," Hank gasped, stepping back, sweat pouring down his wrinkled face. "Pull it." Dakota stepped forward. Her hands were shaking violently. She grabbed the cold steel of the wheel and pulled with all her might. The massive 10-inch thick door swung outward on its heavy, lubricated hinges, perfectly balanced despite weighing over a ton. The stale, preserved air of 1987 washed over them. Dakota grabbed the work light and stepped inside the vault. She expected to see rows of empty safe deposit boxes or perhaps canvas bags of forgotten cash. Instead, the vault was almost entirely empty, save for 2 things sitting in the center of the concrete floor. The first was a mountain of canvas mailbags tied shut, the canvas rotting away to reveal thousands of pristine, undelivered letters. But it wasn't the letters that made Dakota's blood run cold. Sitting next to the mailbags was a heavy, reinforced wooden crate. It was wrapped in thick steel banding, and stamped perfectly into the wood on the side of the crate in faded red ink was the seal of the United States Department of Defense, accompanied by a stark, terrifying warning, proprietarily, auf Huber, as Government. Project Dorin, do not open. Levhall contamination hazard. Dakota stared at the crate, the silence of the basement suddenly deafening. She hadn't just bought an abandoned post office. She had bought a government secret. And judging by the heavy footsteps suddenly echoing on the hardwood floor above them, Richard Sullivan was tired of waiting. The heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor above them were deliberate, methodical, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Someone had kicked in the boarded-up side entrance of the post office. Down in the basement, the air froze in Dakota's lungs. Hank instantly killed the high-powered work light, plunging the basement into an impenetrable darkness, save for the weak, dying beam of Dakota's smartphone. "Turn that off, kid," Hank hissed, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He reached into his heavy canvas tool bag and pulled out a heavy steel pry bar. "We got company, and they didn't knock." "Mr. Sullivan?" Dakota whispered back, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone as she powered the screen down. "Probably his muscle," Hank muttered. "Old man Sullivan doesn't get his Italian loafers dusty. Listen to me. The coal chute. It's on the north wall behind those filing cabinets. It leads up to the alley. If things go south, you squeeze through there and you run. You don't look back for me." "I'm not leaving you," Dakota said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You will if I tell you to," the old safecracker snapped. The heavy, groaning sound of the trapdoor being wrenched open echoed from the top of the concrete stairs. A beam of harsh, tactical LED light pierced the gloom of the basement, sweeping across the rusted filing cabinets and the dusty floor. "Miss Hastings," a deep, booming voice called out. It wasn't Richard Sullivan, it was Parker Trent. Sullivan's head of acquisitions, the man Dakota had seen idling in the Lincoln Navigator. "Richard sent me down to help you pack. He said the structural integrity of this building is severely compromised. It's for your own safety." Heavy combat boots began descending the concrete steps. Clack, clack, clack. Dakota looked at the vault. The masked thing she truly noticed. Lost a Widerling and Trude noticed, and food that masked the mailbags. If Trent saw what was inside, she was dead. Or worse, she would disappear, becoming just another Grafton County cold case. She had seconds to act. She darted into the vault, her sneakers completely silent on the concrete. She didn't have time to mess with the steel banding on the terrifying wooden crate. Instead, she grabbed the top layer of the canvas mailbags. The rotted fabric tore instantly in her hands, spilling a cascade of pristine, yellowed envelopes onto the floor. Beneath the letters was a heavy, manila envelope wrapped in thick, black, electrical tape. It felt solid, heavy. She shoved the taped envelope and a handful of the scattered letters into her oversized jacket, zipped it up to her chin, and darted back out of the vault, just as Trent's flashlight beam hit the fake drywall partition. "Well, well," Trent's voice echoed through the basement. He stepped around the corner, his tactical light illuminating the massive open Mostler safe. He let out a low whistle. "Old man Sullivan was right. You did find it." Trent wasn't alone. Two other men, built like linebackers and wearing dark tactical gear, stepped out of the shadows behind him. "Back away from the safe, little girl," Trent ordered, pulling a heavy, suppressed automatic pistol from his shoulder holster. Hank didn't hesitate. With a feral grunt, the 71-year-old safecracker hurled a heavy brass dial puller right at Trent's face, simultaneously kicking over a rusted metal shelving unit. The massive crash of cascading steel and old paperwork filled the basement, kicking up a blinding cloud of 30-year-old dust and asbestos. "Run, Dakota," Hank bellowed, charging the two goons with his pry bar raised. Gunfire stifled by the suppressor to sound like violent coughs punched through the darkness, shattering the concrete behind Dakota's head. Panic seized her, pure and absolute, but survival instincts overrode her fear. She scrambled over the fallen shelves, diving behind the rusted filing cabinets as the basement erupted into a chaotic brawl. She found the old coal chute exactly where Hank said it would be. The iron hatch was rusted shut, but the sheer, unadulterated terror pumping through her veins gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She slammed her shoulder against the iron plate. Once, twice. With a screech of tearing rust, it gave way. Dakota squeezed her body into the narrow, filthy shaft, clawing her way upward toward the faint sliver of moonlight. She burst out into the freezing alleyway, scraping her elbows raw on the brickwork, and tumbled into a pile of wet garbage. She didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and sprinted into the tree line bordering Elm Street, the freezing New Hampshire wind biting at her tear-stained face. She ran until her lungs burned with the taste of copper, until the imposing silhouette at the abandoned post office was swallowed by the night. 2 hours later, shivering uncontrollably in the back booth of a 24-hour truck stop 10 miles outside of town, Dakota finally opened her jacket. She pulled out the handful of letters in the heavy manila envelope. The letters were all addressed to various federal agencies, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Office of the Inspector General. The return address on all of them was the same: William Sterling, Postmaster, Grafton Branch, 1987. She tore open the first letter. It was a frantic, handwritten confession. "If you are reading this, they have already killed me," the letter began. "My name is Bill Sterling. For the last 2 years, I have intercepted illegal shipments moving through this county. Governor Parker Sullivan Richard's father has been using his political leverage to siphon classified defense assets from the decommissioned Pease Air Force Base." Dakota's eyes widened. She read faster. They claimed Project Orion was a toxic waste disposal initiative. "It's a lie. The DoD crates don't contain lethal contaminants. They contain unregistered Treasury bearer bonds and the original land deeds to the entire northern quadrant of the county land the federal government secretly bought up during the Cold War. The Slavin family has been orchestrating a massive land grab, stealing billions from the American public. I hid the final shipment in the newly installed Mosler vault and faked an asbestos contamination to get the building condemned. It was the only way to protect the evidence. I have attached the ledger. Do not trust the local police. The Sullivans own them all." Dakota dropped the letter. Her hands were shaking violently, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization of what she held. She grabbed the heavy, taped manila envelope and used a pen to rip through the thick electrical tape. A small black leather ledger fell onto the sticky diner table, along with a thick stack of crisp green paper. She picked up one of the papers. It was an authentic 1980s-era United States Treasury bearer bond. The denomination printed in the corner made her choke on her own breath. $1 million. There were at least 50 of them in the stack. $50 million in untraceable, completely legal tender, alongside a ledger that perfectly documented decades of systemic corruption, theft, and murder orchestrated by the Sullivan family. Richard Sullivan didn't want the post office. He didn't even want the bonds. He wanted the ledger. The ledger was the only thing that could rip his billion-dollar empire to the ground and put him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. And now a 23-year-old girl who had been sleeping in her Honda Civic possessed it. Her phone buzzed, shattering the silence of the diner. It was an unknown number. She stared at it for a long moment before answering, pressing the speaker to her ear. "Dakota," a smooth, chilling voice said. "It was Richard Sullivan. You caused quite a mess in my new building tonight." "Where is Hank?" Dakota demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. "Mr. Caldwell is currently resting comfortably in the trunk of my car," Sullivan replied smoothly. "He's a stubborn old man, but he doesn't have to die. Neither do you. You have something that belongs to my family, Dakota. I want it back." "You mean the proof that your father was a thief and a traitor?" Dakota snapped, her anger temporarily eclipsing her terror. Sullivan chuckled, a dry, lifeless sound. "You're out of your depth, little girl. You think anyone is going to believe a homeless drifter? The police chief works for me. The county judge works for me. If you go to the authorities, you will be arrested for breaking and entering, and Hank will be found at the bottom of the quarry. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring the envelope to the old lumber mill on Route 9. Come alone, and I'll give you $1 million in cash and let the old man go. If you don't..." The line went dead. Dakota stared at the black screen of her phone. She was completely isolated. She couldn't call the local police. She couldn't run. Sullivan had her only friend in this town. But as she looked down at the letters of Postmaster William Sterling, a desperate, reckless plan began to form in her mind. Sullivan thought she was just a scared kid. He was about to find out exactly what happens when you corner someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. A heavy mist clung to the abandoned Route 9 lumber mill, turning its rotting structures into ghostly silhouettes. At 7:55 a.m., Dakota's battered Civic rolled onto the gravel, coughing to a stop. She stepped out, clutching her messenger bag, heart pounding but resolve unshaken. Richard Sullivan waited in the loading bay, flanked by armed men. A metal briefcase rested nearby, his version of leverage. "Did you bring it?" Hay called. "Where's Hank?" Dakota shot back. Sullivan signaled, and Hank was dragged from the trunk, bruised but alive. "Let him go. So the bag first," Sullivan replied coolly, offering $1 million payoff. Dakota hesitated, then stepped forward, pulling out a duct-taped envelope. Sullivan's eyes gleamed. He nodded to his man. "Take it, then shoot him." "Ha ha ha! No!" Dakota shouted, sharp, deliberate. The signal. An armored vehicle smashed through the gates as FBI agents stormed the mill, weapons raised. Red laser sights cut through the fog. Sullivan froze as agents swarmed him. "You're under arrest," Agent Reed announced. Sullivan raged, denying everything until Dakota calmly handed over the real ledger she had hidden on her. "The proof," she said quietly. Hours earlier, she had called the FBI trading fear for strategy. Now, as Sullivan was dragged away, his empire collapsing, Dakota rushed to Hank. "You're insane," he rasped. She smiled through tears. "You told me to run. I just chose the right direction." The aftermath of the lumber mill bust became national news by the end of the week. The FBI raided the old post office, securing the Mosler vault and extracting the DoD crate. Inside, they found exactly what the ledger promised: $50 million in stolen bearer bonds and the original deeds to hundreds of thousands of acres of stolen land. The entire Sullivan empire crumbled overnight, seized by the federal government under racketeering charges. As for Dakota Hastings, under the False Claims Act, a federal law that allows private citizens to sue on behalf of the government for fraud and receive a percentage of the recovered funds, Dakota was officially recognized as a federal whistleblower. Because her evidence led to the recovery of stolen treasury assets and land, a federal judge awarded her a bounty. It wasn't $1 million in a shady aluminum briefcase. It was 15% of the recovered assets. $7.5 million. 6 months later, Dakota stood in front of 402 Elm Street. The scaffolding was up, and construction crews were busy tearing off the rotted roof. She hadn't sold the building. Instead, she had hired Hank Caldwell as her lead project manager. They were turning the old post office into a community center and a low-income housing complex, a permanent anchor of hope in a town that Sullivan had tried to bleed dry. She walked up to the heavy oak doors, running her hand along the scarred wood. She thought about the terrified, desperate girl who had sat in that freezing gymnasium, raising her hand to spend her last dollar on a ruined building. Sometimes, hitting rock bottom is the only way to discover what's buried beneath it. And for Dakota Hastings, the ultimate treasure wasn't the millions in the bank, it was the steel in her spine, forged in the darkness of a forgotten vault. If this wild, true story of survival, hidden federal secrets, and a young woman outsmarting a corrupt millionaire kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this incredible true crime tale with your friends to spread the word about Dakota's bravery. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, crazy, real-life mysteries uncovered from the past. See you next time.